Now that we've spent some time talking about different environmental factors, including increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, and decreased forest cover, I think it's time to start linking these environmental factors to the main focus of this part of the class, which is the causes of violent conflict. This photo is of American military personnel in Morocco in 2019 doing a joint military exercise with the forces of several other African states. And it is an ongoing effort in the United States to play a constructive role in the region to try to reduce conflict. Of course, it's also in the U.S.'s strategic interests to try to reduce conflict in a number of conflicted parts of the region because there is an idea that it's best to try to reduce the uncertainty in the host countries so that people and the instability that violence creates doesn't spread over borders in the region or cause the kind of movement of people across borders to try to escape violence that can lead to issues within Africa as well as increased migration across the Mediterranean or radicalization further afield, including in the United States. There's around 6,000 U.S. Department of Defense forces on the continent, a large number in the Sahel region, the the desert area that almost stretches across the northern part of the continent that divides North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. The uh, uh, the Australian, where am I? The Australian Defence Force also has troops in South Sudan and in Egypt, as well as other locations around the world. Um, so I think we as Australians also have a vested interest in trying to understand the causes of conflict and instability in the region. We're going to be touching on a number of different cases in the Sahel because it's one of the places in which you have a changing climate leading to increased desertification in areas in which people were already having a difficult time providing for human security of the citizens. And so it's going to be a case study in a lot of the examples that we're going to look at of climate change's effects on human security and adaptive capacity, and therefore on conflict. This lecture this week is the last major overview class in which I've tried to start with background materials on the causes of conflict right generally in week one, then look at economic models of conflict because after the grievance literature, the greed literature, the economics literature was the next kind of major wave in conflict research. After that, pretty soon afterwards, there was a resurgence in interest in political institutions and their capacity to prevent or to co opt dissent. And then this week, climate change and conflict. We're going to be touching on a lot of the issues that we've covered today for the remainder of the semester, but I wanted to provide an overview of the issues of resource scarcity and abundance, environmental change and factors that we're going to be building on later on in the semester. Um, in section 2, we're going to look at specific causes, population factors leading to conflict, stationary, and then population mobile, migration issues, and then the water and food that everyone depends on, and then the natural resources we require, and then the disasters that can threaten our ability to adapt or deal with short-term or long-term disasters. When you look at how the environment cross-sectionally as well as environmental change and shocks, a common theme in this class has been there's different effects in slow-moving structural change that are background conditions that don't change as much, and then short-term shocks, either economic or political, we've already touched on, and later in the class we're going to be looking at climate-based shocks as well, food shocks and others. This path diagram from the World Health Organization I thought was useful because it's I'm a fan of path diagrams, but then also they show how this can work in ways that Homer Dixon and others also kind of look at it, but each one is slightly different. Human pressure on the global environment of the kind that agricultural production or forest loss would manifest would lead to land degradation and desertification, an issue in the Sahel, Florence, Florence, forest clearance and land cover change, which we've already touched on, ozone depletion, which we're going to look at later, general climate change measures, biodiversity loss, freshwater depletion, urbanization, other issues that we're going to be touching on. But basically, humans are putting in pressure on the land. This is manifested in the air, the land, the sea, and the water that we drink. And that can lead to health impacts, ecosystem based mediated health impacts, and then more indirect measures, impacts, including conflict. So they kind of group these outcomes as being a direct impact from health outcomes. Different people like Homer Dixon include multiple steps between these different outcomes. This, I thought I would start with the article because a lot of good but long books start as more concise articles. Thomas Homer Dixon's 1994 article, which we read for this week, and his 1999 book is longer and also worth your read. But it was one of the earliest and one of the more influential systematic efforts that try to look at through a lens of conflict on what the impacts of environmental scarcity or abundance would have. And so that's why he looked from in a qualitative framework at a number of specific cases, and like Barnett and Adger and a couple of others make these kind of explicit links that kind of are the basis of the framework of the class: environmental factors, human security, and conflict. He outlines towards the beginning of this article the six main drivers that he finds in his cases for driving the causes of conflict: greenhouse induced climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, degradation and loss of good agricultural land, degradation and removal of forests, depletion and pollution of freshwater supplies, and depletion of fisheries. So hopefully you've noticed an overlap in some of these areas to the World Health Organization path diagram, because this literature that we're reading has been quite influential in how policymakers understand a lot of these challenges. We're going to touch on a lot of these in more detail. I chose two, forest and agricultural land, to kind of show you the initial trends earlier, and that we're going to be coming back to later on. But we're also going to touch on fisheries. The degradation and competition for fisheries in Somalia has been one of the areas in which you see links with increasing amounts of terrorism or piracy, because people didn't have the livelihood to be able to support themselves. They had to choose other, sadly, sometimes more violent measures. These are the couple of overall areas, background kind of causes of conflict, the direct link and testable hypotheses that Homer Dixon includes. This week, again, you want to look at the observable implications of the arguments and the testable hypotheses in the articles and books that we read, because it is a distillation of what the expectations are that come from the arguments that different writers are making. Homer Dixon has three basic types. This is going to be crucial for pretty much the rest of the semester to understand the links between different environmental factors: food, land degradation, water, etc. And three different types, or three different links that Homer Dixon outlines: simple scarcity conflicts, group identity conflicts, and deprivation conflicts. Hypothesis 1, decreasing supplies of physically controllable environmental resources will lead to conflict. This is an absolute argument, right? Instead of a relative measure, just the fact that if you just are not having enough to be able to scrape by, that increases the chance of conflict, right? It's a it uh, it links to the cost benefit analysis arguments that we saw after this in Collier and Hoffler 1998 and others, that if you have simple scarcity, the opportunity costs of engaging in violent action goes down dramatically because you're just trying to survive. The second is group identity conflicts. Large population movements cause environmental stress, which lead to conflict. We're going to look at a couple of examples of that today and in subsequent weeks. That because of the scarcity in the first part of the first hypothesis, people have to move to try to survive. This brings people into contact with each other that hadn't been in the past when there was sufficient resources, and it could increase the scarcity for everybody, which should increase the risk of conflict. Deprivation conflicts is the third type. Environmental scarcity will lead to increased economic deprivation and disruption of social institutions, which will lead to conflict. So that is more of an interactive and multi-step process. Scarcity leads to economic deprivation, not just absolute deprivation, but relative deprivation, and it could cause issues with political institutions. We've saw with food price protests in a number of different areas that when there is scarcity and when people don't have enough, they can use violence, but they can also hit the streets to try to protest for change, and that could weaken political institutions, overturn governments, and that can escalate to violence, right? So three distinct but interrelated links between environmental scarcity and conflict. Another way to kind of visualize it is through how the resource pie is divided. I love pie. This country is not as pie obsessed as the United States is, which is, and there's not as many diners in the same kind of way as in the US. So I'm a fan of pie. And so food analogies are always a winner for me. But Homer Dixon's sources of resource scarcity, renewable resources, in this case, environmental change shrinks the resource pie. Renewable resources would be forests, water, right? Other resources that would normally renew, that if you deplete the resource base, that should shrink the overall amount of pie that gets divided up between peoples within an area, within a country, or between countries. Population growth. We saw the graph of the dramatic increase in population over the last 20 or 30 years. This increases the number of slices the pie has to be broken out into. And unequal resource distribution means that there are winners and losers. Some people get larger, bigger shares of the pie than others, which could lead to disagreement and conflict. So unequal resource distribution is going to be another ongoing theme. Last week we talked about the measures of inequality. Different countries have higher or lower measures of inequality. Looking at Australia, we have increasing levels of inequality over the last 15, 20 years, but it's still relatively low compared to other countries like Brazil. So Brazil's inequality has gone down pretty recently. Australia has gone up, but it's going to take a while for Australia to get even close to Brazil levels. Different parts of the world have, for historical, colonial, geographical reasons, evolved different systems that have led to different types of redistribution. So you have different levels of this depending on where you're looking at. Mentioned the Gini index earlier. I'm going to put after this video a link to a good explainer on how the Gini index is created from the Department of Statistics in Singapore. because I think they do a good job at explaining the Lorenz curve and how the distribution of income and wealth according to the size of the population. They can graphically do it in a much better way than I could get a piece of paper or Kleenex or something or do it, but it wouldn't work as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, as well as more technical discussions about how comparable these measures really are between countries, depending on how you define or divide up income in family units. But getting back to Homer Dixon, here is his another one of a path diagram from the article, and he includes a number of these in the book, but I think is another way of visualizing this multi-step process between the environment and conflict. Salan and others have also made the case that this is a multi-step process, and that's why we take 12 weeks to try to break it down into these different chunks, so that we can better understand the often conditional nature of these relationships. So he starts at the left, environmental scarcity due to decreases in quantity or quality of resources, population growth, and that inequality that we touched on. That increases scarcity, which could decrease either environmental production or leading people to migrate. It weakens states, and you can look at how that could be defined according to you're looking at taxable income the government receives, or human outcomes, how long people live, how much education people get within a country. These things can be expensive, and it can be harder for people to receive if their state isn't well enough off to provide it, and this could lead to people's cost benefit analysis shifting to either decrease the costs, increase the potential benefits, for leading to conflict. So we're going to be coming back into that. One thing I wanted to touch on with Homer Dixon before I move on, and in the workshop we're going to be going into the readings in more detail, is his unique research design compared to a lot of the other readings we do for this class. And that is, I don't know if you noticed this in the reading, or if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to take a look at it, in that the cases he looks at are selected because they have environmental scarcity and conflict, and looking at the ties between them. And so in a direct way, he's selecting not just on the dependent variable, only cases that have had conflict, but also on the independent variable, cases in which you have environmental scarcity, this gray box here in this 2x2 table. And that's something that in my methods courses when I was in grad school, well, I was always told that this was a no-no, right? That these cases might not be representative of the broader relationships between these two variables in other cases, right? We looked at so far in this class already that grievances are universal, but conflict is not. So, right, in that case, grievances would be observed everywhere, but conflict still varies. So the independent variable is fixed, but the dependent variable varies. And so you can. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the benefits and costs. We're going to be talking about this more in the workshop, and I'll definitely let you know my take on this. But before I inflict that on you, I wanted you, for the second lecture question, to go to Waddle and answer the question, what are, where is this? What are a few costs and benefits of only looking at cases in which there's both environmental scarcity and conflict? Can we have faith in the conclusions that we reach? Does it allow for a better understanding of these relationships? If you can only think of costs or you can only think of benefits, that's fine. But I'd be interested in your few sentences description about what you think the benefits and costs are of selecting the cases you look at in this way. And this applies to your research papers as well, because most of you will be choosing one or two cases to look at. How are you going to choose them according to these kind of 2x2 diagrams in which you have one, either the outcome you're interested in as only conflict, or only not conflict, or only places in which there is scarcity or not. So how can we learn something from the Homer Dixon example that could apply to your own research?